Vivid verses.
I learned the truth on a Thursday evening in late October, standing near the back wall of a small dining room that smelled of cardamom and slow-cooked lamb, holding a glass of pomegranate juice I hadn't touched in 40 minutes. The dinner was at Sua's aunt's house, a modest place, warm in the way that only homes with too many people and not enough chairs manage to be. Round table, mismatched plates, a small television in the corner that nobody was watching but nobody had turned off. The kind of gathering I'd come to know well over the course of my relationship with Sua. Her mother's side of the family, first-generation immigrants who'd built something solid from very little, people who worked hard and cooked even harder and expressed love primarily through insisting you eat more than was physically comfortable. I like them. I want to be clear about that. I genuinely like these people. Sua's mother, Hyunja, sat at the head of the table. She was a small woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair pulled back precisely and hands that were always moving, adjusting a dish, folding a napkin, straightening something already straight. She'd been polite to me for 2 years in the way someone is polite to a waiter they don't intend to tip. Correct. Courteous. Sealed. I'd always put it down to the language barrier. She spoke no English. My Korean was limited to about 14 words, exactly 3 of which were useful at a dinner table. Sua translated everything, or so I believed. That was before Felix pulled me aside. Felix was a family friend, 50s, barrel-chested, with the energy of a man who'd spent decades mediating between people who didn't want to be mediated. He'd immigrated at the same time as Hyunja, lived 2 streets over from the family for 20 years, and spoke both English and Korean with equal fluency and zero filter. I'd always liked him. He had the particular charisma of someone who never said anything simply because it was easy to say. We'd ended up near the back window, while Sua was in the kitchen helping with dessert. The rest of the family was scattered, some at the table, some in the adjoining room watching something on a phone. Felix had drifted over to me the way he always did, casually, as if we'd simply wound up in the same orbit. He topped off his own glass, glanced toward the kitchen, and then looked at me directly. "I need to say something to you," he said. His voice was low, not whispering, just quiet, controlled, and I want you to hear it as someone who respects you, not as someone trying to cause trouble. I looked at him. Okay, Hyunja thinks you don't have a job. I kept my face still. That was the first thing, the automatic response, to simply absorb rather than react, by myself 2 seconds to understand what was actually being said. She thinks I'm unemployed. She thinks you've been between jobs for most of the time you've been with Sua, that you're vague about your work because there is no work. He paused. She also thinks you've been unfaithful, that there was, maybe still is, someone else. I felt something settle in my chest. Not the hot flare of anger, not the sick drop of shock. It was something quieter and more deliberate than either of those things. The sensation of a picture coming into focus. Like watching a blurred image sharpen 1 pixel at a time until what you're looking at becomes completely, undeniably clear. "You've heard this from her directly," I said. "Tonight. And other times." He set his glass down. "I've heard her talk about you, and I've heard Sua translate what her mother said. And those 2 things have never matched. Not once. Not even close." He shook his head slowly. "I should have said something sooner. I told myself it wasn't my place. But watching you stand here tonight, being warm to these people, not knowing what's actually been constructed around you," he stopped. "It wasn't right. What else does her mother think?" Felix exhaled through his nose. "That you're indifferent. That you come to these dinners as a performance. That you don't actually care about Sua's future or her family's well-being. That you're the kind of man who's comfortable enough in the relationship to coast, but not serious enough to commit." He paused again. "She's been telling Sua for months that she should leave you." I thought about the way Hyunja, looked at me. The politeness with a lid on it. The way she'd sometimes say something in Korean, something that seemed by its length and tone to be substantive, and Soo-ah would turn to me and offer a single-sentence summary that never quite seemed proportionate. She says the food is good tonight. She says she hopes work is going well. Small, safe translations that I'd accepted without question, because why would I question them? Because it never occurred to me that anyone would build a lie that elaborate and then maintain it for 2 years. That was the thing I was now recalibrating. There's something else, Felix said. Tell me. She mentioned you specifically tonight before dinner. I was helping carry in the chairs from the back room. She didn't know I was close enough to hear. He looked at me steadily. She said she wonders why Soo-ah is loyal to a man who has no ambition and no integrity. She said she's ashamed when she thinks about what the rest of the family must assume. He let that sit for a moment. She said all of this assuming it would never reach you. Because she believes, because Soo-ah has apparently made her believe, that there is no way for her words and your understanding to ever meet. I looked across the room at Hyunja, who was now talking quietly with one of her sisters. She had no idea that the wall between us, the wall she'd been speaking freely behind for 2 years, had just developed a door. Felix. I turned to him. Thank you. He nodded once. What will you do? I'm going to finish the evening. Then I'm going to have a conversation. He studied me for a moment. I think he'd expected something more volatile. Relief or anger, or at least some visible sign of the earthquake that should have been happening under the surface. Instead, I was calm. Not numb. I want to be precise about that. Calm and numb are entirely different. Numb is when the signals stop arriving. Calm is when they arrive, and you sort them without drama. Because drama serves no purpose and clarity serves every purpose. You're not angry, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm something, I said, but not angry. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I picked up my pomegranate juice. Let me ask you one thing. Of course, if I addressed her mother directly tonight, in Korean, would it be appropriate in this setting? Socially, I mean, for the family. Felix blinked. Then, slowly, a small and complicated smile moved across his face. How much Korean do you speak? More than Soo-ah knows, I said. I should explain that. I'd started learning Korean about 14 months ago. Quietly, methodically, the way I do most things, with consistency and without announcement. I'd signed up for a language app, found a tutor who did remote sessions twice a week, and built a daily practice into the margins of my schedule. My motivation at the time was sincere and straightforward. Soo-ah was important to me. Her family was important to her. And being able to communicate, genuinely communicate, even imperfectly, with the people she came from seemed like the obvious way to close a gap that had always bothered me. I hadn't told Soo-ah because I'd wanted to surprise her. I'd imagined some warm evening where I'd say something directly to her mother and watch Soo-ah's face light up with that specific kind of surprise that crosses into pride. Instead, I was standing at a back window in October, holding pomegranate juice and doing arithmetic on 14 months of lies. My Korean was not fluent. I want to be honest about that. But it was functional, conversational in the practical sense. I could handle a real exchange. I could follow the shape of a sentence even when a word escaped me. And I could, if I chose to, make it very clear to someone that I understood what they were saying. The evening passed. I ate. I helped clear plates. I accepted more food than I wanted and expressed gratitude I met. I watched Soo-ah move through the room with the ease of someone who felt entirely safe, and I cataloged every moment she translated between her mother and me. There were 3 such moments over the course of the remaining hour. The first, Hyunja said something during the fruit course that was clearly a question, multi-part, her eyes moving between Soo-ah and me. Soo-ah turned to me and said, "She asks if you've been staying busy." What her mother had actually said, and I caught perhaps 70% of it, enough to understand the shape. Was something closer to an inquiry about whether I was contributing meaningfully at home, followed by a comment that had the word for effort and family, and what I was fairly confident was the Korean equivalent of pulling his weight. The second, I made a comment about the food, a genuine one, something I said directly to Hyunja about the way the broth tasted, and she replied at some length. Suah translated this as, she says she learned from her mother. What the response actually contained, based on what I could parse, was a sentence I couldn't fully decode, and then a question I recognized immediately because I drilled it during one of my early language sessions. The question meant, approximately, does he always say nice things to appear charming, but does he mean it? The third, just before we left, Hyunja and Suah had a brief exchange in the hallway while I was putting on my jacket. It lasted maybe 45 seconds. Suah came back to me and said, she says it was nice to have you. What I've been able to hear, standing 10 feet away with my back partially turned, included several words I knew and a phrase my tutor had specifically warned me was considered harsh in formal family contexts. It did not mean it was nice to have me. I said goodbye to Hyunja warmly, the way I always did. She received it correctly, which is to say, she gave me her sealed and appropriate smile and said the things politeness required. I thanked Felix with a handshake that lasted a half-second longer than usual. He held my eyes. Then Suah and I walked out to my car. The night was cold, the kind of cold that has texture to it, the edge of real autumn, air that smells like dried leaves, and something mineral underneath. I unlocked the car and we got in. I started the engine to warm it and then sat without pulling out of the space, looking through the windshield at the row of houses across the street. Suah was on her phone, a message or social media, the small automatic scroll that people do when silence opens up. She was relaxed. Her coat was unzipped. She had the slightly drowsy quality of someone who'd eaten well and spent time with people they loved. I watched her for a moment without her knowing I was watching. I had several options in front of me, and I was sorting them without hurry. I could say nothing tonight, take the full measure of what I'd learned, think it over carefully, come back to it from a place of total preparation. That had a certain tactical appeal. I could initiate the conversation directly, call out, put everything Felix had told me on the table, and watch how she responded. That was honest but blunt and would immediately shift her into defense mode, which tends to produce denial rather than truth. Or I could ask her something that appeared open but was in fact a test, something that gave her the opportunity to tell me the truth voluntarily, to offer it freely. Because here was what I needed to understand, the how and the why. Not the fact of it. The fact was already established. Felix was not a man who fabricated things, and the translations I'd witnessed tonight were sufficient confirmation on their own. The lie was real. The only questions remaining were the ones that would determine what this meant and what came next. Why had she built it? That was the question that genuinely unsettled me, more than the lie itself, more than the 2 years of it. People fabricate things for reasons: vanity, insecurity, fear, protection, control. Each of those reasons points to something different about the person and the relationship. I needed to understand which architecture I was actually living inside, and she needed the chance to tell me herself. So I said, conversationally, almost idly, as if it had simply occurred to me, "Tell me what your mother thinks of me." I turned my head slightly so I could see her face. She looked up from her phone. There are expressions that last fractions of seconds, the involuntary kind that the brain produces before the learned social surface reasserts itself. They're impossible to manufacture and almost impossible to suppress. In the forensics of conversation, they're the most reliable data available. What crossed Suah's face in that first fraction of a second was not puzzlement, not the natural blankness of someone processing a straightforward question about a pleasant evening. It was a very fast calculation. I clocked it and said nothing. Just waited. What do you mean? She said. Just curious. I kept my voice easy. We've been having these dinners for a couple of years, and I've always relied on you to tell me what's going on between you and her. What she thinks. I realized tonight I've never really asked you directly. I paused. So what does she think of me? Another fraction of a second. The calculation running again, faster this time, under time pressure. She likes you, Suwa said. She thinks you're respectful. She appreciates that you come to these things, that you're consistent about it. She shifted slightly in her seat, not quite toward me, not quite away, a careful neutral angle. She said tonight that it was really nice having you. I told you. That's what you told me, she said, yes. A beat. What else? I said. I mean, she's not super expressive, you know that. She's not the type to make a big speech about how wonderful you are. But she's told me she thinks you're a good person. Suwa smiled. It was a practiced smile, not a cold one, warm, in fact. That was what made it notable. The warmth was real, just deployed in service of something untrue. She's not easy to impress. The fact that she's always welcoming when you come, that's a lot from her. I'll let her finish. She held the smile for a moment, and when I didn't immediately respond, something in her eyes shifted almost imperceptibly. A slight alertness. The first sign that the ground might not be entirely stable. You've never had any doubt about that? I asked. About what? About whether what she's expressing to you and what you've been communicating to me have been the same thing. Very carefully now. Very precisely. Of course, she said. I'm right there. I'm translating. I nodded. I turned my eyes back to the windshield, and then I spoke to her in Korean. Not perfectly. I won't pretend otherwise. There were moments where I reached for a word and had to use a different one, where the grammar came out constructed rather than fluent. But the content was clear, and my pronunciation was close enough that the meaning was unambiguous, and I watched her understand every word. I said, in Korean, approximately, I've been studying your language for a little over a year. I wanted to tell you as a surprise. This is not how I imagined that going. The expression on her face was extraordinary. It moved through surprise, disbelief, and then, in the span of about 3 seconds, arrived at something more complicated. Not quite fear, not quite shame. Something that was both of those things processed through the specific anguish of a person who has been comprehensively caught and knows it. I switched back to English. Not harshly. I want to be precise about this. My voice stayed level. I'm not going to pretend I understand everything that was said tonight. I told her. My Korean isn't there yet. But I understand enough to know that the woman I've been sitting across from at these dinners is not the woman you've been describing to me. I paused. She thinks I don't have a job. She thinks I've been unfaithful. She thinks I come to these things without any real intention toward you or your family. I looked at her. She thinks very little of me, and she has apparently thought very little of me for a long time, because those aren't conclusions someone arrives at quickly. Suai had gone very still. Her phone was in her lap, forgotten. That's, she started. I'm not finished, I said. Not sharply, just with clarity. She stopped. I want to understand why, I said. Not why you thought you could keep it hidden. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in why you built it in the first place. Why you decided that the person your mother knows should be someone different from who I actually am. I let that sit for a moment. Because you could have given her something real. My work. The fact that I'm committed to you. The fact that I've spent a year learning her language because I wanted to be able to talk to her without you in the middle. You had access to all of that. You chose to give her something else. Suwa exhaled. It was a shaking sound, not quite crying, not yet. The breath of someone standing at the edge of something. My mother has expectations, she said. Everyone's mother has expectations. You don't understand what they're like. What she's like. What it's like to be measured against. She stopped herself, rerouted. She has a very specific idea of what my life should look like, who I should be with, what that person should be. I knew she wasn't going to another stop. I was managing it. I was buying time. For 2 years, I thought it would get easier. I thought if we were just together long enough, if things progressed, she'd have to accept it. She'd have to accept a man she'd been told was unemployed and unfaithful. The words landed. I watched them land. I watched Sua's face register the complete illogic of what she'd constructed, the trap she'd built, and then somehow forgotten she was standing inside. I never meant for it to go this far, she said. It went exactly as far as you took it, I said. Every dinner, every conversation, every time you looked at me and told me, she said something kind when she'd said the opposite. I kept my voice even. That's not a small thing that got away from you. That's a sustained choice. Sustained for so long that Felix, who was there at the beginning of all of it, felt he had to tell me himself because he couldn't watch it continue. Her head turned slightly. Felix, yes. He told you. He did. Out of respect. I looked at her directly. You should think about the fact that a man who's known your family for decades decided that what was happening to me was wrong enough to intervene. That's not a small judgment. She was quiet for a long moment. The heater was running now, and the car was warm, and outside the houses were lit against the cold dark, and everything looked entirely ordinary, which is sometimes how things look precisely when they're not. What do you want me to say? She asked. Her voice was smaller now. Not performed, genuinely small, the way a voice gets when a person has run out of the scaffolding they've been standing on. I don't want you to say anything right now, I told her. I want you to think about 2 specific questions. The first, whether you believe you can actually rebuild something honest with your mother from what you constructed. Not whether you want to, whether you can. Because she doesn't know me. She knows a character you invented. Correcting that isn't a conversation. It's a demolition and a rebuild, and it will be harder than you're probably calculating. I paused. The second question, why you decided I wasn't worth the honest version. Whether there's something about who I actually am that you thought wouldn't survive her scrutiny, or whether it was never about me at all, whether it was entirely about your own discomfort with her judgment, and I was just the element you adjusted because I was the one who couldn't check. She looked at me, and in her eyes there was something real for the first time since I turned my head and asked my simple question. The thing behind all the management. The actual person under the strategy. She said quietly, I was afraid she'd make me choose. And I didn't want to choose. Her voice caught once, steadied. So I made it so I wouldn't have to. If she thought you were something small, something temporary, she wouldn't push. She'd just wait. And we could just, she stopped. Exist in the middle, I said. She nodded. I absorbed that. I held it up and looked at it from several angles. It was a recognizable architecture, not uncommon. People build these suspended spaces when they can't tolerate the weight of a decision, especially the decisions that involve people they love pulling in opposite directions. The lie hadn't been cruelty. It had been conflict avoidance at a scale that had long since crossed into something else. That didn't make it acceptable, but made it legible. Here's the problem with the middle, I said. You needed 2 things to be simultaneously true for it to work. Your mother needed to believe something about me that kept her quiet, and I needed to believe something about your mother that kept me from noticing, which means you were maintaining 2 separate fictions at the same time, and both of them required me not to have access to the truth. I looked at her. That's not a relationship. That's a managed environment. I'm not interested in being managed. I know, she said. Do you? A long silence. The windows had begun to cloud slightly at the edges from the warmth inside. I'm sorry, she said. I believe you. I put the car in reverse. But sorry is a description of how you feel. It doesn't answer either of my questions. I pulled out of the space and pointed the car toward home. We drove for a while without talking. That was my choice. I'll let the silence be what it was. I wasn't punishing her with it. I simply had more thinking to do, and the thinking required space that conversation would have filled. Here's what I was working through. The lie itself was finite. It was a thing that had been done and could, in theory, be undone. Lies of that kind, when they're not rooted in contempt or malice, are survivable in a relationship if the person who constructed them can face what they've built. The question was never whether I could forgive the act. The question was whether she could tolerate the exposure that honesty would require going forward. Because here was the version of events in which we could move past this. She would have to call her mother. She would have to revise 2 years of character construction, walk back every false thing she'd said, and introduce her mother to a version of me that was real. That meant admitting to her mother that she'd lied. Not vaguely, not softly, but specifically and at length. And then it meant giving her mother the actual version of me and accepting whatever her mother did with that. That was enormous. I wasn't minimizing it. Her fear of that conversation was not irrational. It was a genuinely difficult thing, the kind of thing that could permanently change a relationship with Hyunja or force a confrontation that had been deferred for decades. I could see exactly why she'd chosen the easier architecture. The tragedy was that the easier architecture had required her to construct me as someone disposable. And the version in which we could not move past this. If she looked at what I was asking, honesty with her mother, a full correction, no more middle spaces, and found she couldn't do it, or chose not to. If the discomfort of that conversation was still greater, even now, than the importance of having a real partnership. If I would always be the element she adjusted when the pressure got to be too much. That was the version I needed to measure against. Not dramatically, just clearly. I was still measuring when she spoke. I know what the questions are, she said. Her voice was steadier now, still small but controlled. I've been thinking about them since you asked. I glanced at her briefly, then back at the road. The honest answer to the second one is that it wasn't about you. She said this quietly, without theater. It was about me. About the fact that I have never been able to have a real conversation with my mother about what I want my life to look like. I turned that into something I did to you, and she paused. That's not a thing I can explain away. I know it isn't. I'm not asking you to explain away. I know. She turned her face toward the window. The answer to the first one is that I don't know if I can rebuild it. I want to believe I can. But I've been telling myself things were manageable for 2 years, and clearly my judgment on what's manageable isn't reliable right now. She let out a slow breath. What I do know is that if I don't try, if I just let it stay the way it is, then whatever's left of this isn't worth what it costs you. I listened to that carefully. It was an honest thing to say. It was, in fact, the most honest thing she'd said all evening. I need something specific from you, I said. What? I need to know that the next conversation you have with your mother is a real one, not a correction in the margins, not actually he does work while leaving everything else standing. The whole thing. She needs to know who I am, the real version. I kept my eyes on the road, and I need you to have that conversation before I see her again. A silence. That's fair, she said. It's not a punishment, I clarified. I'm not trying to force a confrontation for its own sake. I'm telling you that I can't walk into that house again and sit at that table knowing that her understanding of me is built on fabrication. It would be dishonest of me, and I've had enough dishonesty in this particular dynamic. I understand. And one more thing. She waited. I'm going to speak Korean to your mother the next time I see her. Not to prove a point, because I spent a year learning how to do it, and I want to use it, and I want her to know I made that effort. I paused. Whatever she thinks of me after you've talked to her, I'd rather face that honestly than be comfortable inside a version of me she invented. Suwa was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the streetlights moved past in slow orange intervals. She's going to be ashamed, she said finally, when I tell her. She's going to understand that she's been saying things about you thinking there was no chance you'd ever know. And you've known more than she thought this whole time. A pause. She's going to be so ashamed. That's hers to carry, I said, not unkindly. Same as what you carry is yours. Another stretch of silence. We were getting close now. I could see the familiar landmarks accumulating at the edges of the headlights. The turn coming up. What happens to us? She said. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't know, but because the question deserved a real answer and not a reflexive one. I don't know yet, I told her. Not because I've made a decision I'm not sharing. Because this is genuinely a thing I'm holding while it resolves. I made the turn. What I do know is that the version of us that can survive is one where neither of us is being managed. Where your mother knows exactly who I am, and you've given her that information at real cost to yourself. Where there's no adjusted version of me floating around that you can deploy when the actual version gets inconvenient. I pulled into the space and put the car in park. If that version is possible, I'm interested in it. If you find that you can't actually get there, that the cost of the honest conversation with your mother is more than you're willing to pay, then I'd rather know that now than be managed for another 2 years. I turned off the engine. The car was quiet. Outside, the night was still. I'll call her tomorrow, Suah said. Her voice was stripped down to something plain and unornamented. The voice of someone not performing anything. I looked at her. Not because you're making me, she said. Because you're right that it's already cost too much. She held my eyes. And because you spent a year learning to talk to my mother, and the version of you she's been given doesn't deserve that. And the version of you that actually exists does. I held her gaze for a moment. I didn't say anything warm. I didn't say anything hard. I just looked at her and let what she'd said sit where it had landed. Then I got out of the car. I stood on the pavement for a moment in the cold, the night air hitting after the warmth of the car, and I looked up at the sky. No stars, cloud cover, flat and low. Just the ambient light of the world bouncing back off gray, making everything mildly visible. I heard her door open and close. She came around the front of the car and stood a few feet from me, her coat zipped up now against the cold. I'm going to fix it, she said. I'll believe that when I see it. I told her. Not because I doubt you right now. Because that's simply the correct standard. She nodded. That was all. No protest, no further argument. We walked inside. I held the door and she went through first, and behind us the cold stayed where it was, doing what cold does, keeping everything honest, keeping everything exact, maintaining precisely the temperature was without any interest in being something warmer than it had become.
Thanks for listening.